And all I can see is his arm, and in his hand, I see a 12-inch kitchen carving knife. And I see the knife, and I'm going, mate, you don't need to do that. Mate, you don't need to do that. Without saying a single word, we brought the knife straight down and stabbed me to the chest. But I think at this point, I froze. I remember watching him. I remember his hand, and he was just repeatedly stabbing me between my checks.
Stabbing victim Natalie Queiroz MBE talking to inmates in a Category C men's prison and young offenders institution about the attempted murder of her and her unborn baby by her then partner. I've been granted special permission to be inside HMP Swinfen Hall in Staffordshire, home to 18 to 20-year-old long-term sentence prisoners, for this week's Convex Conversation. I want to get an understanding of what life is like behind bars in a high-security jail and see firsthand some of the ideas introduced by today's guest, who has dedicated nearly 4 decades to the prison service and reform. Swinfen Hall comes under the responsibility of Mark Greenhaf, Prisons Group Director for the West Midlands. Mark is passionate about rehabilitation and has created numerous strategies and programmes in the various prisons he's worked at and been governor at, in an attempt to break the cycle of violence in our ever-growing prisons population. Swinfen Hall is where he first brought in Keeping the Peace, a project to help change the narrative when he was governor here. And it's how he first met Natalie, who, following her attack, has become victims advocate for West Midlands Police and Crime Commissioner and a dedicated campaigner for victims' rights. Today, I'll be joining Mark and some of the inmates as they listen to Natalie's story and get to talk to her afterwards about the impact being stabbed 24 times whilst heavily pregnant has had on her life, in a crime so violent she and her baby were lucky to survive. Mark, thank you so much for getting permission from Swinfen's governor and allowing me to visit one of the prisons that comes under your remit. As a journalist, I think I've covered lots of Crown Court trials, lots of crime stories, but often the court case has been where that story's ended for me. I've never been inside a prison. I would imagine many of our listeners haven't. So I thought perhaps it would add a bit of context today to our conversation.
Yeah, thank you firstly for inviting me to be on your podcast. I really do appreciate it. And I think the Natalie story is really relevant to, I guess, the journey of some of the people that are being held in custody at Swinfen Hall. Swinfen Hall looks after young people who are aged between 18 and 28, but people who are serving perhaps quite significantly long sentences. Some of those people having been sentenced as young as 14, 15 years of age and are looking at perhaps 20, 30 years in prison before they get released. And I think Natalie's story not only resonates with them in terms of the crime that she was victim to, and some of the people held in custody here at Swinfen Hall would definitely have been involved in knife crime, as an example, murders. But I think her story is one of hope, that a particular life event, in Natalie's case, a traumatic stabbing, doesn't have to define you for the rest of your life. And I think it's an important message for some of the prisoners here at Swinfen Hall that despite the long sentences that some of them have been given by the courts, that they do have a life after custody. And I heard I guess there was a quote by a guy called Ricky Otto, who I did some work with here at Swinfen Hall, where he used to say to the prisoners, don't serve your time, let your time serve you. And I think there's some relevance in that our two main aims are public protection, protecting the public, but prisons should be places of rehabilitation. And I think, therefore, that quote that Ricky told me a number of years ago is really relevant in that make best time of your sentence, make best time of the time you are in custody while you are a captive audience, and try and do something that can change your path in life.
I think what struck me when they all came in, rather unexpectedly actually, it took me by surprise. Suddenly we were in the chapel and it was empty and peaceful and quiet, and the door was unlocked and in came about 30 inmates. I think what really struck me was their age, and I was lucky enough to have a chance to talk to some of them afterwards. And you realise that some of the crimes they've committed are very serious, murder, attempted murder, things like that. But these are young lads who, even if they're serving a 20-year sentence, have a chance to make something of their life in their 30s and their 40s. So hope's really important. I just wonder what messages you think they would take away from listening to Natalie's story today.
I think the majority of them will go away from that talk that they've heard today, and I guess a point of reflection. Natalie talked a bit about you don't expose your real self, you only expose a little bit of yourself to the outside world, and I think they will be reflecting on what, I guess, the takeaway points for them on their futures, and hopefully that they will think about what they can do while serving a sentence that will change them as people to become, I guess, positive citizens in their community, and when they do get the chance to be released from prison, that they make best use of their lives going forward. So I'm really hopeful that they will draw a sense of hope from it for their futures, but that they will make good use of their lives in the future when they are eventually released from prison.
They were quite lively when they came in, but you could hear a pin drop. Natalie spoke for about a good hour and a quarter, maybe an hour and a half.
So I had to do a proper police interview, lying in a bed with tubes hanging out of me, fighting for my own life, because at this point I was still critical, not knowing if my baby was going to be alive. It was absolutely horrendous. And they come up to me and they say, Natalie, we arrested the man on the scene and we're holding him on police custody. Natalie, there's no easy way to tell you this, because the man that we've arrested and we're holding in police custody is your partner, Bobby.
And there were some incredible questions afterwards. And in fact, you met Natalie, didn't you, when you were doing your Keeping the Peace campaign, and in fact, when you were governor here at Swinfen Hall?
Yeah. So, I came to Swinfen Hall, I think it was 2021, and I was actually asked if I would come to Swinfen Hall. It was a prison that was experiencing quite a lot of violence at the time, and I knew that I was coming here. In the weeks before I came here, I was on holiday, and I was actually given a book by one of my mentors who works outside of the prison service, and the book was called High Conflict and How to Get Out of It. The author is Amanda Ripley, I think. And the book is about conflict that happens from whether it's marriage conflict, when two people are divorcing and how do they get into a high conflict situation, whether it was gangs in LA, and there was some stuff in other parts of the world. And it just gave me this idea of how could I implement how do we keep the peace message rather than how do we reduce violence? And when I started here, that was the first thing I did. I held some forums with some prisoners that were here, and I just said, look, I've got this idea on changing the messaging on how we can improve safety in this prison, and would you be willing to engage with me on how we could keep the peace rather than how we could reduce violence? And it is a play on words, I guess, but that was the start of the journey, really. And I had some good buy-in from staff, good buy-in from prisoners, really good support from some people who were already working here, a probation officer that already had a relationship with Natalie. And that was really the start of me thinking then about how I could have Keep the Peace advocates, or Keep the Peace icons, as I called them. And there was a number of people then that became part of a growing number of Keep the Peace icons that I used to come into the prison and talk to prisoners in very much the same way as Natalie talked this morning. There was really good buy-in from the prisoners to think about what that would mean in the prison, wanted to create their own artwork, wanted to come up with their own colour schemes for Keep the Peace, and then involved a conflict resolution company that then trained the peacekeepers themselves, acted as supervisors for them. And I guess it organically grew where staff started to really trust the peacekeepers to deal with low-level issues on wings and act as almost like mediators, I guess, between two prisoners that were in conflict. And it really took off, and it really did make a difference to the overall safety of the prison, with decreases in prisoner violence, violence from prisoners towards staff. And it also had a knock-on effect in that it did have an impact on the overall attrition rates of our staff working at Swinfen Hall. So I was really proud, actually, of that Keep the Peace scheme that was put in place and the support that I got from staff.
And the peacekeepers, were the peacekeepers inmates themselves that had taken on the responsibility?
Yes, peacekeepers were advocates of the programme. They were prisoners themselves. They were trained to do the work, and they were there to support staff. They might have known what the conflict was about between two prisoners that those prisoners would never have told staff about. And they were proactively dealing with issues before they become a problem. And therefore, it did make the place a safer prison for everybody, which is a great thing.
We had a walk round the prison yard and we saw some of the artwork that was designed by the prisoners and some quotes, their own quotes that are on the yard wall. Just tell me a bit about that walk we had, where we were in terms of those two wings and the fence and the artwork, just to give a sense of what you're dealing with. Yeah,
we just had a general walk out into the prison, but the area that you describe, it's an exercise yard that provides that opportunity for exercise for prisoners on two of the wings at Swinfen Hall. And the artwork was artwork that was put in place when I was the governor here. And it was part of Keep the Peace. The quotes that you described were quotes that prisoners came up with that we introduced as part of the artwork. And I think it was good at the time to have those quotes in that prisoners were really engaged with the Keep the Peace idea and initiative, and for them to come up with those quotes and then to see them actually on a piece of artwork in the way that the artist did, I think was really powerful, actually. But I guess the area that you saw is quite a big space. It allows prisoners here at Swinfen Hall to have some time in the fresh air. They're really well-equipped yards with exercise equipment and such like, which I think is really important for this age group, 18 to 28-year-olds. They have a lot of energy, and I think their physical health alongside their mental health is really important. Opportunity in the fresh air, opportunity to exercise is all part of that.
I'm guessing a lot of the inmates here come from gangs and from a gang-related background. Do you have to be quite careful about who mixes with who in terms of prisoners? Because I can imagine that the gang sensitivities on the outside don't stop just because they're here on the inside.
Yeah, we absolutely have to be careful. We have processes that we put in place to make sure that where there is conflict between two people or two or more people that are affiliated to a particular area of a city or an absolute gang affiliation, that we have ways to keep those apart. At Swinfen Hall, there's 9 wings here at Swinfen Hall, so there's good opportunity to be able to do that, but without putting restrictions on the regime that is available for them. So that time out of cell, that time to go to work and time to go to the college and re-educate and time to go to the gym and in fresh air and all of those sorts of things, we have to make sure that we get the balance right so that the restrictions that we do place on people don't impact on their ability to access a really decent regime.
We saw a good example of that, I think, on the yard, didn't we, where the fence splits 2 different wings. So you can have 2 different wings out in the fresh air at the same time, but hopefully avoiding any conflict between the inmates. And in many cases, have the men here, and indeed in the other prisons where you've been governor, often do they come from a background where violence has been part of their young lives?
People who end up in custody come from all sorts of backgrounds. A lot of people who are in custody come also from a care experience background. So people who have seen a lot of trauma in their young lives, and certainly conflict and trauma is very much part of their lives that have resulted in them coming into custody.
I spent time with some of the inmates I met today after Natalie's talk and had a chance to have a chat with a couple of them.
I'm personally in jail for murder right now. I got convicted of murder when I was 17, and I got sentenced to 19 years to life. These mistakes happen in life, and it's all about making changes. Natalie, she's a very strong inspiration to women.
What did you take away from her story? Because as well as explaining what happened to her, I thought there were some takeaways for you guys about, not giving up and planning for the future, because you might have a long tariff, but you're still young.
Yeah, exactly. That's why I say she's an inspiration as well, because she's giving people hope. She's going around to jail. She's going around on the outside giving people hope, and that's what it's all about. That's what inspiration is, giving people hope. It's actually quite a dark world, you know what I'm saying? And that's why awareness needs to be spread about all of these type of things, about even knife crime and that. The youth need to know that at the end of the day it's not worth it. I think most of us, especially like us with long sentences, long birds to go through, we all regret it. It's just it's about having hope, do you know what I'm saying? It's about at least trying to make a difference, you know what I'm saying? Even if it's as small as helping someone out while I'm in jail, or helping out people while I'm in jail, do you know what I'm saying? I'll do that because I know that it's giving back to the community.
Can I ask why you're in Swinfen Hall?
When I was 16, I was arrested for 2 attempted murders. I was sentenced to 16 years when I was 18. And ever since then I've just been, trying to change.
You're a young man now. Hopefully you'll have a life on the outside while you're still a young man. What hopes do you have for your life, and what are you doing inside here to try and build for the future, even though it's a way off?
I just try to talk to everyone that's around me and try to see the pattern. Why we all do things, why we all done this, why we all done that, how we could have done things different. Just looking back and how I can change things for the future. Maybe it was too late for me to know. I didn't have anyone out to change me. I didn't have anyone to tell me, yo, you're doing this, you're doing that, that's not good. So, but maybe I can tell people, yo, you're doing this, you're doing that, it's not good. Leader of the youth down the right path.
We're in a bad situation where we're on the wings, life a wing. But there's a lot of hope. When I speak to a lot of my brothers, there's a lot of hope, because we've been in a dark situation, like Natalie. We're in a dark situation, and we try to uplift ourselves into a better one. Do you know what I'm trying to say?
Mark, Natalie's not the only victim and inspirational person that you've brought behind prison walls before. What impact does it have bringing people like Natalie? I'm thinking of a mum that was featured on Channel 4, I think it was Alison Cope, whose son died a violent death. How does that help change the narrative?
I think stories such as Natalie's and Alison's that you've talked about they're an opportunity for prisoners to hear things from a different perspective. I think there's something powerful about Natalie talking as an actual victim of knife crime, but then also Alison's talk is very much about being the mum of somebody that is murdered through knife crime. That it does give that sense of perspective of, to the audience, this is something that I potentially did to people that I don't even know. People that I will never ever meet, people that had no understanding that I would have impacted on their lives in the way that has been described to me by those people. And I guess my hope with all of these talks that I did and Keep the Peace icons that we were talking about earlier is that I think prisons are places of rehabilitation. And in the same way that when your children are growing up, you're trying to find something that hooks them in. And it might be, you might have to try 5, 6, 7, 10 things, and eventually you find the one thing that they're really passionate about. And I think rehabilitation in prison is trying to throw as many hooks for change at prisoners, really. And it might be the Natalie talk, it might be the Alison talk, it might be drama, it might be music, it might be sport, but what is the thing that's going to hook them in to go, that's more important to me than misbehaving in prison and losing that? And I think our job in prisons is about to create as many hooks for change as we possibly can, in the hope that that then becomes something that somebody gets passionate about, and it becomes, I guess, the vehicle for a change in their behaviour. It becomes the thing that puts them on a different path. And all I try to do as a prison governor is trying to create those opportunities and those events that might be the hook for an individual.
And for somebody like Alison, one would imagine it takes an awful lot of courage to come into a prison and come into a room of people that she knows, some of whom have committed knife crime, some of whom have taken people's lives, and to stand there as a mum and tell your story. I bet it was powerful stuff, was it, with Alison?
With Alison and with Natalie and other people that I know have spoken in prison, the bravery, I don't know how they do it, actually. To be able to talk as eloquently as they do about the impact on them, their families, the wider community, is such a powerful story to tell. And I think both of Natalie and Alison, I think it's the authenticity of it. They are really speaking from a place of hurt, a place of anguish. But I think the thing that struck me about both of those talks is that the message to the people that they're talking to is absolutely clear. Don't let this thing that you're in prison for, this offence that you committed, as horrible as it might have been, be the thing that defines you for the rest of your life. And I think to work in prisons and be truly somebody that thinks about prisons as a place of rehabilitation, you have to accept that as human beings, we all mess up sometimes. And the scale on some of the things that people have done wrong is serious, but people deserve a second and a third and a fourth chance. And there's very few people in prison in England and Wales today that are going to be in custody for a whole life term. And therefore, the majority of people in custody are going to be released at some point into the community. And I truly believe my job is to try and do whatever I can to rehabilitate those people so that it, in the long term, creates a better public protection arena for the wider community. I've always looked at it, I've got 4 children, I've got grandchildren, I've got sisters, and I've got a wider family network. And I guess I always look at this in that I try to bring it down to that level, really. And my job is about trying to prevent any of my loved ones being victims of crime. My whole career has always been about rehabilitation. Not that I ever thought it was. I definitely didn't join the prison service to be the person that changes people's lives. I joined the prison service because it was a secure job, a job for life with a good pension, etc., etc. And it was probably my early experiences within the prison service and understanding that there was this role, a PE instructor, that I did become. It reminded me of my school days when my PE teacher in school was really important to me. And he was actually one of the people that I went and spoke to before I joined the prison service to say, I'm thinking of joining the prison service. What do you think? And he said, no, don't do it. It's not a job for you. You're too sensitive. You won't last, and all of that. So that was his opinion. I valued his opinion, but I didn't take his advice.
You did it anyway.
I did it anyway. And I think that opportunity that I had to become a PE instructor for the majority of my time in that role at a prison that held 15 to 18-year-olds, I was around 27, and it was almost like that fatherly figure. It was a great opportunity to show them a different path. It was in different times where I used to go out into the community and do rock climbing and abseiling and kayaking and mountain biking and hill walking and all of those things that kids from central London and central Manchester and Liverpool had never really experienced. That, for me, was the start of me thinking prisons is about rehabilitation and we should try our very, very best to put people on the right path.
And do you think you saw, as the PE teacher, I'm thinking back to school where PE was always great fun and it was a highlight of the week, that suddenly you're the guy there for those inmates who's about doing something interesting, getting out of their cells, doing something physical, having fun, and that maybe you saw the impact of doing climbing, going out walking, getting them out. Did you perhaps see the impact that was having on them and perhaps helping them with their mental health, that made you realise that actually the rehabilitation process is really important because you could see a difference in some of the inmates you were looking after.
Yeah, absolutely. There was a different time when we used to take prisoners out probably twice a week when I was working there on release on temporary licence to do all of those outdoor activities, which included Duke of Edinburgh Awards and that sort of thing. But it was definitely hooks for change in people because people behaved within the custodial environment. The prison was safer because of it. And those hooks were hooks that they didn't want to lose. And they actually put people on a different path. And I've come across many a prisoner in the community that I've been involved with in a prison and saw the successes that they've made of their lives. And it's quite a moment when you bump into somebody and they're now a personal trainer within a gym somewhere, and you're the person that actually taught them those qualifications, and they've held on to that and they've been released from prison and they're now really active, positive citizens in the community doing a great job and serving the public.
It's a fine line, isn't it? Because obviously some of the lads I met today, you realise they owned up to their crimes and they said what they did. And in one case, it was a 17-year-old who'd murdered somebody when he was 17. So always you think about families and what some families gone through because of his actions. But what struck me about the inmates I spoke to today is they owned their crimes. They know they're in here for 20 odd years or whatever, but they want to make better lives when they come out. They talked about wanting to inspire other youngsters. So it's not giving them an easy, cushy time in here and making it easy. They are serving time. They're in their cells and they are here. It's society's way of punishing bad things. So it's a fine line, that rehabilitation point, isn't it?
It is a very, very fine line. And there are lots of people in prison that have committed some horrendous crimes that have been deeply impactful in terms of victims, families of victims, and none of that is lost on me. Absolutely not. But I can honestly say that in all of my career, which is pretty extensive, that I have never looked at, right, what is prisoner Jones serving a sentence for? It's not something that ever really enters your mind. They're an individual. I know that they're serving a sentence for something, and you treat people as individuals and you treat people as human beings. That was my personal experience, and I think probably speak for a lot of people that I've worked with over the years, that the crime is not something that we really focus on when we're talking about opportunities within the prison. Yes, we look at that when we're thinking about offender behaviour programmes that people need to do, what risk levels they are to other people, to other prisoners, to staff, to themselves. So we do all of that stuff, but you're dealing with an individual and you treat them as individuals.
You started off being a PE teacher. When was the moment you realised that actually, hang on a sec here, if I put some schemes in and come up with some ideas, I can actually start to make a real difference here? Was there a tipping point?
I was 5 years as a prison officer before I became a PE officer. So I did that on the landings back in the late 80s and early 90s before I was a PE instructor in 1993, actually. But I think the moment was probably my first posting. It was to a prison called Onley, which is in Rugby in Warwickshire. And I went into that prison in 1988, not knowing that there was this PE officer opportunity. And I think it was seeing the work that those PE instructors were doing in the prison that got my attention. I was always someone who came from a sporting background, played rugby from the age of 6 and involved in sport throughout my school. And I thought, I want some of that. And some of the stuff that they were doing within the prison, having a football team, a rugby team, a basketball team that played in the local leagues, putting events on for prisoners, teaching them first aid, teaching them other qualifications and skills. That was the thing I think that hooked me.
And I suppose you saw everything working on the landings.
Yeah.
Is that fairly hardcore?
Yeah, working on the landings is very different.
What's it like?
This was 1988. Pretty much all prisons were still slopping out at that point, so there was no integral sanitation
Really?
in any prisons at that point. There was a lot of overcrowding. Things were very different. First thing in the morning, it was slopping out, routines. There was always a cooked breakfast in prisons back then, so you had the stench of people slopping out against the background of bacon and sausage cooking on the landings, so you'd have all of those mixtures of smells. Prisons were smoking then, so you'd have the air often thick with smoke from cigarettes, that sort of thing. So it was a very different environment. Lots of experienced staff working in the prisons. I had a really good couple of mentors when I first joined the prison service to teach me. Prison officer training back then was around about 16 weeks long, I think it was. And that's just the start of your training. You rely on the experience of those mentors to teach you on the job. But it was a very different environment.
But those landings didn't put you off. We're looking at an almost 40-year career now.
Yeah.
And you've kind of chosen, Mark, I know you go home at the end of the day, but your life has been very much on the inside, hasn't it? And I know it's changed, particularly from our walk today. And it's a very different place to the landings that you described in the 80s. But what's kept you passionate about this job?
The honesty is I was always very happy. The best job I ever had at the time, I thought, right, a PE instructor in a prison. I did that for 11 years. And then I did a total of 14 years in PE. The back end of that, I was a principal officer in the gym. And it was like the best job in the world. It was like getting paid to do something I was passionate about, so it didn't feel like a job even. I was working in a gym. I was doing all of the stuff that I described earlier outside of the prison, teaching people to kayak, to swim, to fish, to mountain bike, all of those things. It was an absolute pleasure to work in prisons. And it was actually a governor that said to me, what are you doing with your career? And I was in around about 2005. And I said, well, I'm really happy doing what I'm doing, thank you very much. And he said, have you ever thought about doing the assessments to become a governor grade? And I guess governors in prisons, so you have the governor of the prison, you have a deputy governor, and then you've got functional heads who are also governor grade. So I guess the way to describe it is very much like a school, where you've got the head of the school, you've got the deputy of the school, and then you've got heads of year who will be responsible, head of biology or head of chemistry or whatever. So you've got the governor in charge of the prison, you've got the deputy governor, and then you've got a number of other people that are in charge of different functions such as security, safety, reducing reoffending, offender management, those sorts of things. So I did the assessments to become a governor grade. I passed them. And there's a little bit of a joke in prisons that PE officers, we can only write in crayons because they think us as not academic. And anyway, so I passed these assessments, and that was the start of my journey into a governor grade position. And I think the thread through my career is I'm not talented in any way, shape or form. I left school with very few qualifications. I didn't go to university. I was a carpenter when I left school. Did that from the age of 16 till I was 22 when I joined the prison service. And you didn't need any qualifications to join the prison service. So it was a great job to apply for. But a thread I think that people would say about me is I am absolutely committed to what I do. I'm hardworking. And I think that just comes from my childhood, really, from having a set of parents that have always grafted through life, multiple jobs. My dad was a merchant seaman. He joined the Merchant Navy when he was 16 till he was 22. Both my mum and dad worked in factories pretty much all their life. They only bought what they could afford, and they worked 2 and 3 jobs to be able to afford stuff. But that was normal. We never went on holidays or anything like that. You just did what you needed to do to put food on the table. I'm from a mining village in South Wales originally. So I think my work ethic comes from my parents, and I've just worked hard, really. And I've always been in a job, and then I've gone, I wonder if I could do that job. And I wonder if I could do that job, and I wonder if I could do that job. And I've just really put my name in the frame and put my application in and worked as hard as I possibly can. Try to be innovative, actually. I think I've always tried to be quite innovative in the things that I do within prison. I think they can be pretty mundane environments if you don't. I tried as governor to be, I guess, in the same way as in your private life, you have things to look forward to in the diary. I think prisons are a bit like that, in that you've always got to have something in the diary to look forward to, something to inspire the staff, something for people to get on board with, a common purpose, a common goal. It creates a good news story in that once you do this event, it creates a bit of a buzz in the prison for prisoners and staff, and then you organise the next thing. And that could be a wellbeing event for staff, it could be a sports day, whatever it may be. But you've got to have these things, because otherwise I think they could become quite boring and mundane environments.
I think you're making a difference. And I think as you've climbed the ranks, of course you're making a difference in those early days doing the PE and everything. But as you've climbed the ranks and taken different positions and governor positions, and now to your current position, I wonder if it's that quiet satisfaction that I'm sure you know in your heart, Mark, that through some of the schemes you've brought in, you are helping, making a difference. Am I right?
I don't really look at it that way. I really don't, honestly.
You're humble.
and I said to you earlier today, I was like, I really don't know why you're interviewing me for this programme, but I've listened to some of your podcasts, some extremely inspirational people that you've had on your podcasts, and I felt a bit of a fraud this morning when I thought, right, I'm going to do this podcast.
You're not a fraud at all.
I try to make a difference. I think my role now is very much about supporting the governors in my region to do the very best that they can do. Hopefully I'm achieving that. Hopefully I'm supporting them as much as I possibly can to be effective in their roles. And I'm really proud that the governors in the region that I'm responsible for are doing some really great things.
In 2016, then Prime Minister David Cameron promised to make prisons, and I quote, places of positivity and reform, places of care, not just punishment, where the environment is one of rehabilitation and mending lives. That's 10 years ago now. Mm-hmm. How did he do on that promise? And I know he wasn't Prime Minister for that length of time, but how are we doing, do you think?
Yeah, that period, I guess it coincided actually with me moving from Brinsford Prison near Wolverhampton to open a brand new prison in North Wales, HMP Berwyn. And we had about 18 months leading up to the prison opening in February 2017 to try and think about what did we want this great big prison to be. And it was opening as a public sector prison. It was the first public sector prison that had been opened in a fairly long period of time. And it was going to be a big prison, and it was 2,100 prisoners. So
it was huge,
it was the largest prison at the time that was opening in England and Wales. And we set about as a project team that transitioned into being the senior leadership team in that prison to be really focused on being a rehabilitative prison. And I think the work that went into opening that prison, overall, it was a success story. And I think there was a huge focus on prisons being rehabilitative at the time. Unfortunately, what's happened is that the events of COVID, which then resulted in backlogging courts, a population pressure crisis in prisons in England and Wales, that resulted in a number of different schemes that allowed prisoners to release people back into the community. So there's been the backdrop of rehabilitation versus that challenge of operational capacity moving through COVID, which was a really tricky time for everybody in the community, but also in prisons. And I think not that there's not a will to want to rehabilitate, and I don't know a governor that doesn't want to provide rehabilitative opportunities for prisoners in any prison in the country, but there's also that challenge and focus on trying to serve the courts and the huge issues around population pressures to deal with alongside that. So it's a balance, I think, is what I'm trying to say. There's a tricky balance on rehabilitation and dealing with overcrowding, crowding population pressures within the service, and the need, I guess, to keep the criminal justice system moving in the right direction.
You actually started your 84-page Cambridge University thesis with David Cameron's quote and wrote a whole document on it all. Is it also really difficult for prisons, given the political changes? That, at one point we had a number of prime ministers, didn't we, over a very short space of time, and a number of different chancellors. Is that one of the big challenges that prisons face today?
I think it's a challenge. But I'm a civil servant, so I'm there to serve the government of the day. And I think regardless of whoever is in political power, that my focus in any role that I've had in any prison is just about trying to do the right thing and trying to provide the best opportunities I can for prisoners, the best support that I can put in place for staff to do the work that they do, the best training opportunity for the staff, thinking about staff well-being. All of those things are their focus on just doing the right thing. The political party I don't worry about too much. I just focus on trying to provide the best service as I can.
And are our prisons still overcrowded, Mark? Where are we in the UK right now? What's the situation?
I think population pressures have eased. There's been a number of schemes recently, changes to 56-day recalls alongside standard recalls. There's a focus on judges not giving out short-term sentences, and as a result of a number of schemes that the population pressures have eased significantly recently, which is a really good thing.
Going back to your thesis, you said that in Michael Gove's first prison speech as Justice Secretary, this was 10 years ago, he said Victorian jails would be sold off to help fund and upgrade prisons' out-of-date and overcrowded prison estate, and that his intention was to design out the dark corners which too often facilitate violence and drug taking, and build a prison estate which allows prisoners to be rehabilitated. That begs the question, crime takes place on the outside, but what's it like on the inside, Mark? Is there a problem with drug taking inside Britain's prisons, and can it be at times a violent place? And how do you manage all of that?
It's unquestionable that there has been an increase in violence in prisons over the last decade or so. There's also been an increase in self-harm incidents in prisons, and those are real significant challenges for prison governors. The illicit economy in prisons is a challenge. Not just illicit drug taking, but illicit use of mobile phones, those sorts of things. They are a continuing challenge for governors to tackle on a daily basis. But I think staff work extremely hard to try and counter those issues and the ways in which drugs, mobile phones, etc. come into prisons.
It must be very inventive, because having spent the day here behind the fences, behind the barbed wire, the security checks, the mind boggles, and I'm not expecting you to reveal the various ways things are smuggled into prisons. But it's extraordinary, because to me, it's felt a very secure place today. But I suppose when you're locked away for a long time and you have friends on the outside, your mind gets very creative.
Prisons are challenging environments to work in. And I do believe that there's not enough, I guess, credit, really. I'll use the word credit for the work the prison officers do. If people were to ask me prior to COVID whether we could get through the COVID crisis, where prisoners were locked up for significant periods of time, where we had to isolate people, I would have said, I'm really worried about this. But we got through it, and we got through it through the sheer hard work of staff. But I also think there was a common purpose, wasn't there? There was a common purpose in that what we were doing in prison and isolating people and the 2 meters apart and all of those things that we know that we had to do, everybody was doing it. So people in prison were doing it, people in the community were doing it. And therefore, I think there was this common goal, common purpose to prevent people unnecessarily dying because of COVID. But it is a really challenging environment, and I think prison officers, all the prison staff, in whatever job they do in prisons, they do an absolute excellent job day in, day out, under some really challenging circumstances. And I take my hat off to prison officers who come into work every day and do the job that they do, because it is quite extraordinary what they do.
It's full on, and I imagine your world is very full on. You travel a lot, you visit the various prisons that come under your control. How do you decompress from what I imagine is a pretty intense job, Mark?
I am a bit of a workaholic, so I'm not going to shy away from that. But what do? I think things that I've always done, really. Training is really important to me. I tend to train 6 o'clock in the morning before I come to work, and I'll probably train when I get home after work.
To decompress from this podcast.
Yeah, a lot of time in the fresh air, whether it be walking or just up in the hills, that sort of thing. And playing drums. I play the drums. You'd be amazed how much tension you can get out of yourself playing the drums. And just family, really. I think being around with family and friends. I still played rugby all my life, to the age where I could still play rugby. I'm nearly 60 now, so playing rugby, having that camaraderie is very much similar to working in a prison, and camaraderie and friendship, and that is really, really important. So I'm still fairly grounded and rooted in that background that I'm from. Grew up in a mining village in South Wales where it was rugby and athletics in the summer, that was it. When I joined the prison service, and then I went on my, what they call pre-selection to become a PE officer, you get tested on different skills. And I was good at rugby, but I was pretty good at weightlifting and gymnastics and things like that. But I remember a comment that was wrote in my pre-selection diary. When it came to football, they said he's not exactly Maradona. And I thought, no. And I was banned from playing five-a-side football in one prison because I played football like I play rugby.
We will leave it on that quote that you're not exactly Maradona, but you have lived up to expectations as a very good inspirational guest, Mark. So stop worrying that you don't live up to the other people that we've interviewed, because it's been really fascinating. It's been a privilege, actually, to come inside a prison and have you show me round, and hopefully nice for you back at Swinfen Hall, where this was your last governor post a few years ago, wasn't it? So I hope you've had a nice day, and it's been interesting as well talking to some of the lads whose life is here at the minute. So thank you to you, thank you to Natalie, and also thank you to the governor of Swinfen Hall, who's kindly hosted us today.
Thank you very much.
It's been a humbling and thought-provoking experience being here at HMP Swinfen Hall with Mark Greenhaf, Prisons Group Director for the West Midlands, and seeing what daily life is like, particularly for some of the younger offenders here. It's also been uplifting to hear how Mark has put such a lot of effort into rehabilitation and reform throughout what has been and remains a long career so far. He's still going. Download and subscribe to our series at convex.podbean.com, or search The Convex Conversation on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you listen to yours. I'll be back next week with another great guest. Join me then.